Hi guys, welcome to tonight's deep dive into one of humanity's most fundamental yet overlooked experiences from our past. Tonight, we're stepping back in time nearly 1,000 years to explore what childbirth was truly like in medieval Europe. This isn't just a story about medical procedures or historical facts. It's about real women, real families, and real communities facing one of life's most profound moments with knowledge, traditions, and tools that would seem almost unrecognizable to us today. We'll journey through the dark chambers of medieval homes, meet the wise women who served as midwives, discover the prayers whispered over laboring mothers, and uncover the fascinating blend of practical wisdom and mystical beliefs that surrounded the miracle of birth in an age when survival was never guaranteed. From the grand castles of nobility to the humble cottages of peasant families, from the bustling streets of growing cities to the remote monasteries where medical knowledge was carefully preserved, we'll explore how medieval people understood pregnancy, managed labor, celebrated new life, and mourned when things went wrong. This is a story that connects us to our ancestors in the most intimate way possible, revealing how they faced the same hopes, fears, and joys that surround childbirth today, but in a world so different from our own that it might well be another planet. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. To truly understand childbirth in medieval times, we must first paint a picture of the world that medieval women inhabited. The period we call the Middle Ages stretched roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, encompassing a vast span of time during which European society underwent dramatic transformations. Yet throughout these centuries, certain constants remained, particularly regarding the roles and expectations placed upon women. Medieval society was fundamentally patriarchal, organized around rigid hierarchies that determined every aspect of daily life. Women, regardless of their social class, were generally viewed through the lens of their relationships to men, as daughters, wives, and mothers. Their primary purpose was understood to be the continuation of family lines and the management of domestic affairs. The legal status of medieval women varied somewhat across different regions and time periods, but they were almost universally considered to be under the authority of male relatives or husbands. This legal dependency, known as coverture in some areas, meant that women had limited rights to own property, make contracts, or represent themselves in legal matters. However, the practical reality of medieval life often required women to take on responsibilities that went well beyond these theoretical limitations. When husbands were away on military campaigns, trading expeditions, or pilgrimages, women frequently managed entire households, businesses, and even estates. Widows, in particular, could sometimes achieve remarkable degrees of autonomy and influence, though they remained vulnerable to pressure to remarry. The medieval understanding of female biology was deeply influenced by classical medical texts, particularly the works of ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. These authorities viewed women as fundamentally different from men, not merely in anatomy, but in their very essence. Women were considered to be naturally colder and moister than men, qualities that were thought to make them more emotional, less rational, and more prone to various ailments. This theoretical framework had profound implications for how pregnancy and childbirth were understood and managed. The female body was seen as mysterious and unpredictable, subject to influences that ranged from the phases of the moon to the alignment of the stars. Education for women was limited and varied greatly depending on social class and geographic location. Noble women might receive instruction in reading, writing, basic mathematics, and sometimes Latin, particularly if they were destined for religious life. They would also learn the complex skills required to manage large households, including overseeing servants, managing finances, organizing feasts, and conducting correspondence. Peasant women, who made up the vast majority of the medieval population, typically received no formal education but acquired extensive practical knowledge through apprenticeship to their mothers and other female relatives. This knowledge encompassed not only domestic skills like cooking, brewing, and textile production, but also crucial medical and herbal knowledge that would prove invaluable during pregnancy and childbirth. The medieval church played an enormous role in shaping attitudes toward women and childbirth. Christian theology emphasized the story of Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden as the explanation for why women must suffer in childbirth. The biblical passage from Genesis declaring that women would bring forth children in sorrow was taken quite literally, and pain during labor was often viewed as divinely ordained punishment for original sin. This theological framework created a complex relationship between Christian teaching and the practical care of laboring women. While the Church acknowledged that it was natural and necessary for women to bear children, it also promoted the idea that the associated suffering was spiritually meaningful and should be endured with patience and faith. Religious communities offered one alternative path for medieval women, though even within convents and monasteries, traditional gender roles were largely maintained. Female religious communities, however, did become important centers for the preservation and transmission of medical knowledge, including expertise in herbal medicine and midwifery. Many medieval medical manuscripts were copied and preserved in monastic scriptoriums, and some of the most comprehensive guides to women's health and childbirth that survive from the medieval period were produced in religious communities. The daily lives of medieval women were shaped by the rhythm of agricultural seasons, religious festivals, and family obligations. For peasant women, each day brought a demanding array of tasks that began before dawn and often continued well into the evening. They worked alongside men in the fields during planting and harvest seasons, tended vegetable gardens, cared for livestock, processed food for storage, spun thread, wove cloth, and managed the countless details of household life. Pregnancy and childbirth had to be accommodated within this relentless schedule, and women often worked until the very onset of labor. Noble women faced different but equally demanding responsibilities. They were expected to be skilled in household management on a grand scale, overseeing dozens or even hundreds of servants, managing complex financial accounts, and maintaining the social relationships that were crucial to their family's political and economic success. They served as hostesses for important guests, organized elaborate entertainments, and often played crucial roles in arranging marriages and other alliances. When their husbands were absent, they might find themselves responsible for the defense of castles or the administration of vast estates. The concept of childhood in medieval society was quite different from modern understanding. Children were often viewed as small adults rather than as individuals with special needs and characteristics. Infant mortality rates were extraordinarily high, with perhaps 30 to 50% of children dying before their 5th birthday. This harsh reality necessarily influenced how parents and communities approached pregnancy and early child-rearing. While medieval people certainly loved their children and mourned their losses, they also had to maintain a certain emotional distance as a survival mechanism. Marriage in medieval society was primarily an economic and political arrangement rather than a romantic union, though affection between spouses certainly could and did develop. Women typically married in their teens or early 20s, often to men significantly older than themselves. The age at marriage varied considerably by social class and geographic region, but it was generally understood that women should begin bearing children as soon as possible after marriage. Fertility was highly valued, and childless marriages were often viewed as a source of shame or divine displeasure. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life influenced many aspects of medieval culture, including patterns of marriage and childbirth. Weddings were often timed to occur after the harvest, when food was plentiful and families could afford to host celebrations. This timing meant that many first children were born in the late summer or early fall of the following year. The availability of food throughout the year also affected maternal nutrition during pregnancy, which in turn influenced birth outcomes and infant survival rates. Medieval communities were typically small and close-knit, which meant that pregnancy and childbirth were very much community events rather than private family matters. Neighbors, relatives, and friends all played important roles in supporting pregnant women and new mothers. This community involvement extended beyond practical assistance to include emotional support, shared knowledge, and collective celebration of successful births. The downside of this communal approach was that it also meant that pregnancy losses and infant deaths were very public tragedies that affected entire communities. The physical environment of medieval life presented unique challenges for pregnant women and new mothers. Most people lived in single-room dwellings with their extended families and sometimes their livestock. Privacy was virtually unknown, and maintaining cleanliness was an ongoing struggle. Water had to be carried from wells or streams, and heating required constant attention to fires that posed ongoing safety risks. These conditions made the management of pregnancy and childbirth considerably more challenging than in modern settings. Medieval pregnancy was a time of heightened awareness of both spiritual and physical vulnerability. From the moment a woman suspected she might be carrying a child, her daily life became governed by a complex web of beliefs, traditions, and practices designed to ensure the best possible outcome for both mother and baby. Unlike today, when pregnancy can be confirmed through reliable tests within days of conception, medieval women had to rely on the subtle signs and symptoms their bodies provided, interpreted through the lens of traditional knowledge passed down through generations of mothers, grandmothers, and community wise women. The earliest signs of pregnancy were much the same then as now: missed menstrual periods, morning nausea, breast tenderness, and changes in appetite. However, the interpretation of these symptoms was filtered through medieval understanding of female physiology, which was quite different from modern medical knowledge. Medieval physicians and midwives believed that pregnancy occurred when the female seed combined with male seed in the womb, creating a new life through a process that was thought to be influenced by factors ranging from the phases of the moon to the emotional state of the parents at the time of conception. Once pregnancy was suspected, medieval women entered a liminal state that was recognized throughout their communities. Pregnant women were considered to be especially vulnerable to various forms of harmful influences, both natural and supernatural. They were thought to be more susceptible to the evil eye, curses, and malevolent spirits, which meant that special precautions had to be taken to protect them. At the same time, pregnant women were also believed to possess certain special powers or sensitivities, such as the ability to predict the weather or sense the presence of supernatural beings. Dietary practices during medieval pregnancy were based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, which were thought to govern all aspects of health and disease. Pregnant women were encouraged to maintain a careful balance among these humors through proper diet, exercise, and lifestyle choices. Foods were classified as hot, cold, wet, or dry, and expectant mothers were advised to adjust their consumption based on their individual temperament and the current season. For example, women who were naturally considered to have a hot and dry temperament might be advised to consume more cooling foods like lettuce, cucumber, and certain fruits, while those with cold and moist temperaments might be encouraged to eat warming foods like ginger, cinnamon, and well-cooked meats. The medieval diet during pregnancy varied enormously depending on social class and geographic location. Wealthy women had access to a wide variety of foods including fresh and preserved meats, dairy products, fruits, vegetables, spices, and imported delicacies. They might consume foods that were believed to have specific benefits for pregnant women, such as almonds for strengthening the baby, quinces for preventing miscarriage, or special wines infused with herbs thought to ease labor. Poor women, on the other hand, subsisted primarily on bread, porridge made from various grains, vegetables from their gardens, and occasional small amounts of meat or fish. Their diets were often nutritionally inadequate by modern standards, which contributed to higher rates of complications during pregnancy and birth. Fasting was an important component of medieval religious practice, but pregnant women were generally excused from the most stringent fasting requirements. The Church recognized that expectant mothers needed adequate nutrition to support their developing babies, though they were still expected to participate in spiritual observances in other ways. Some pregnant women chose to undertake modified fasting practices, perhaps abstaining from certain types of food rather than reducing their overall food intake. Physical activity during pregnancy was viewed quite differently than it is today. Medieval women were expected to continue their normal work routines throughout most of their pregnancies, which for most women meant engaging in substantial physical labor. Peasant women continued to work in fields, tend animals, carry water, and perform other demanding tasks until very close to their due dates. Noble women maintained their household management duties, which might involve considerable walking throughout large manor houses or castles, climbing stairs, and supervising various activities. However, certain activities were considered potentially dangerous for pregnant women. Heavy lifting, particularly lifting objects above the head, was thought to risk causing miscarriage. Pregnant women were also warned against sudden movements, extreme emotions, and exposure to frightening or disturbing sights. The belief that maternal impressions could affect the developing baby meant that expectant mothers were encouraged to look upon beautiful objects, listen to pleasant music, and cultivate peaceful, cheerful states of mind. The timing of pregnancy was often calculated using a combination of observation of menstrual cycles and various folk methods for predicting due dates. Medieval people were aware that pregnancy typically lasted about 9 months, though they calculated this period somewhat differently than we do today. Some medieval texts suggest that pregnancy could last anywhere from 7 to 10 months, reflecting both natural variation in gestational length and the difficulty of pinpointing exact conception dates. Medieval medicine included various methods for attempting to determine the sex of an unborn child, though these were largely based on folklore rather than scientific observation. The shape of a woman's belly, her complexion during pregnancy, her food cravings, and the way she carried herself were all thought to provide clues about whether she was carrying a boy or a girl. Some medieval texts describe elaborate procedures involving the examination of urine or the observation of which breast began producing milk first. Clothing during medieval pregnancy was adapted from regular women's garments rather than consisting of specialized maternity wear. Women wore loose-fitting dresses with adjustable lacings that could be let out as their bodies changed. Wealthy women might have special gowns made with extra fabric or innovative closures, while poorer women made do with alterations to their existing clothes. The general style of medieval women's clothing, with its loose, flowing lines and adjustable elements, was actually quite well suited to the changing bodies of pregnant women. Medical care during pregnancy, when it was available at all, was provided primarily by midwives and female healers rather than by male physicians. These women possessed extensive practical knowledge gained through years of experience attending births and caring for pregnant women. They understood the normal progression of pregnancy, could recognize signs of potential complications, and knew various herbal remedies and techniques for managing common pregnancy discomforts. The spiritual dimension of medieval pregnancy was as important as the physical aspects. Expectant mothers were encouraged to pray regularly for the health of their babies and for their own survival through the ordeal of childbirth. Special prayers and devotions were associated with pregnancy, and many women made pilgrimages to shrines dedicated to saints who were believed to offer particular protection to pregnant women and their babies. Saint Margaret of Antioch was especially popular among expectant mothers, as she was believed to provide protection during childbirth. Religious medals, amulets, and other protective objects were commonly worn by pregnant women. These might include relics of saints, blessed herbs or stones, or written prayers sewn into small pouches. The line between religious practice and what we might now call superstition was often blurred, and medieval people saw no contradiction in combining Christian prayers with traditional folk practices that had been handed down through generations. The social aspects of pregnancy in medieval communities were quite different from modern experiences. Pregnancy was a highly visible and communal experience, with neighbors, relatives, and friends all taking an active interest in the expectant mother's well-being. This attention could be both supportive and intrusive, as neighbors, relatives, and friends all taking an active interest in the expectant mother's well-being. Pregnancy announcements as we know them today did not exist in medieval times. Instead, pregnancy became apparent gradually through changes in a woman's appearance and behavior, and through the natural gossip networks that existed in small communities. Family members and close friends would likely know about a pregnancy relatively early, while the broader community would become aware over time. The emotional experience of pregnancy in medieval times was shaped by the very real dangers that accompany childbirth in an era before modern medicine. While expectant mothers certainly felt the same joy and anticipation that pregnant women experience today, this was tempered by the knowledge that both maternal and infant mortality rates were frighteningly high. Many women had witnessed the deaths of friends, relatives, or neighbors in childbirth, and this reality necessarily influenced their emotional approach to their own pregnancies. Medieval pregnancy also involved extensive preparation for the possibility that either mother or child, or both, might not survive the birth. Women often made special arrangements for the care of their existing children, settled their financial affairs as much as possible, and made spiritual preparations that included confession and special devotions. This preparation was not considered morbid or pessimistic, but rather a practical and spiritually appropriate response to the realities of medieval life. The preparation for birth in medieval times began long before labor actually started and involved the entire household and often the broader community. Unlike modern births, which are typically planned to take place in hospitals with professional medical staff, medieval births occurred in the home and required extensive advance planning to ensure that everything necessary would be available when the time came. This preparation encompassed practical arrangements, spiritual preparations, and the gathering of the community of women who would assist during the birth. One of the most important aspects of birth preparation was the identification and preparation of the birth chamber. This was typically the most private room available in the house, often the master bedroom if the family was wealthy enough to have multiple rooms. However, in peasant cottages where the entire family shared a single room, special arrangements had to be made to create privacy and appropriate conditions for the birth. The chosen space would be cleaned thoroughly, often with special attention paid to sweeping away any dust or debris that might harbor evil spirits or cause infection. The birth chamber was prepared with specific items that were considered essential for a safe delivery. Fresh straw or rushes were spread on the floor to provide insulation and absorb fluids. Clean linens were prepared in abundance, as medieval people understood the importance of cleanliness during birth, even if they didn't fully understand the modern scientific reasons behind this practice. Warm blankets and clothing for both mother and baby were gathered and stored where they could be easily accessed. Special foods and drinks that were thought to strengthen laboring women were prepared and stored in the birth chamber. Lighting was another crucial consideration in preparing the birth space. Candles and oil lamps were arranged to provide adequate illumination, while taking care to ensure that open flames wouldn't pose a fire hazard during the intense activity of labor and delivery. Some medieval sources suggest that special blessed candles were used during birth, adding a spiritual dimension to the practical necessity of good lighting. The gathering of the birth attendants was a complex social process that reflected the communal nature of medieval society. The primary birth attendant was typically an experienced midwife, a woman who had gained her expertise through years of apprenticeship and practice rather than through formal medical training. These midwives were highly respected members of their communities, and their services were in great demand. A skilled midwife might attend dozens of births each year, and often traveled considerable distances to assist women in labor. In addition to the primary midwife, several other women would typically be invited to assist during the birth. These might include female relatives of the expectant mother, experienced neighbors who had attended many births, and sometimes women who were learning midwifery skills. The number of assistants varied depending on the social status of the family and the customs of the particular community, but it was rare for a medieval woman to give birth attended only by a single midwife. The selection of birth attendants involved careful consideration of various factors beyond just experience and availability. Women who were considered to be particularly blessed, virtuous, or lucky were often preferred as birth attendants, as their presence was thought to bring good fortune to the laboring mother and her baby. Conversely, women who were considered unlucky, who had recently experienced pregnancy losses, or who were thought to possess the evil eye, might be excluded from birth attendants. Men were generally excluded from birth chambers in medieval society, with the occasional exception of male physicians who might be called in during complicated deliveries. Even husbands were typically not present during their wives' labors, though they often waited anxiously nearby and were informed regularly of the progress of the birth. This exclusion of men from the birth process meant that childbirth was very much a female domain, governed by women's knowledge, traditions, and networks of mutual support. The spiritual preparation for birth was as important as the practical arrangements. Expectant mothers were encouraged to make their confessions and receive communion before going into labor, as there was always the possibility that they might not survive the birth. Special prayers and devotions were undertaken in the weeks leading up to the expected birth date, often involving appeals to saints who were believed to provide particular protection to women in labor. Religious objects played an important role in birth preparation. Holy relics, blessed herbs, and religious medals were gathered and placed in the birth chamber where they could provide spiritual protection during labor. Some medieval sources describe elaborate rituals involving the blessing of the birth chamber itself, with priests or other religious figures offering special prayers over the space where the birth would take place. The preparation of herbal remedies and other medical supplies was another crucial aspect of getting ready for birth. Medieval midwives maintained extensive knowledge of herbal medicines that could be used to ease labor pains, speed delivery, control bleeding, and address various complications that might arise. These herbs had to be gathered at the right times, properly dried and stored, and prepared according to traditional recipes that had been passed down through generations of midwives. Some of the most commonly used herbs during medieval childbirth included ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, which was used to stimulate uterine contractions and control postpartum bleeding. However, ergot was also highly toxic and had to be used with extreme caution. Other herbs like pennyroyal, tansy, and savin were used for various purposes related to childbirth, though many of these substances would be considered dangerous by modern medical standards. The preparation of special foods and drinks for the laboring mother was another important task. Medieval people believed that women in labor needed particular kinds of nourishment to maintain their strength throughout the ordeal of giving birth. Broths made from chicken or other meats were commonly prepared, as were special ales or wines that might be infused with strengthening herbs. Honey, which was highly valued for its supposed medicinal properties, was often mixed into drinks or foods intended for laboring women. Financial arrangements also had to be made in advance of the birth. The midwife's fee had to be negotiated and arrangements made for payment, which might involve money, goods, or services, depending on the family's circumstances and local customs. Additional costs might include payments to other birth attendants, expenses for special foods or medicines, and fees for any religious services that might be desired in connection with the birth. The preparation of items for the newborn baby was another important aspect of getting ready for birth. Baby clothes had to be prepared, including swaddling cloths, caps, and small gowns appropriate for a newborn. These items were often made by the expectant mother herself, sometimes with the help of female relatives or friends. The preparation of baby clothes was both a practical necessity and an expression of hope and anticipation for the new life that was expected. Medieval people also had to prepare for the various outcomes that might result from the birth. While everyone hoped for a healthy mother and baby, the high rates of infant and maternal mortality meant that preparations also had to be made for less fortunate outcomes. Arrangements might be made for emergency baptism if the baby appeared unlikely to survive, and plans would be considered for the care of existing children if the mother should die in childbirth. The timing of these preparations was crucial, as medieval people had less precise ways of predicting exactly when labor would begin. Preparations typically began several weeks before the expected birth date, with the most intensive arrangements being made in the final days before labor was expected to start. However, since babies don't always arrive on schedule, families had to be prepared to maintain their state of readiness for extended periods if necessary. Community support networks played a vital role in birth preparation. Neighbors and friends often contributed food, supplies, or services to help families prepare for upcoming births. This mutual assistance was part of the social fabric of medieval communities, where people understood that they might need similar help from their neighbors at some point in the future. The birth process itself in medieval times was a profound and often lengthy ordeal that tested the limits of human endurance and community support. Unlike modern births, which typically take place in sterile hospital environments with professional medical teams and advanced pain management techniques, medieval births unfolded in domestic settings with only the knowledge, experience, and traditional remedies that had been passed down through generations of women. When labor began, the expectant mother was typically moved to the prepared birth chamber if she wasn't already there. The midwife and her assistants would be summoned, often in the middle of the night, as babies then, as now, seemed to prefer arriving at inconvenient hours. The lighting of special candles and the burning of incense often marked the formal beginning of the birth process, creating an atmosphere that was both practical and sacred. The early stages of labor in medieval times were managed much as they are today, with the laboring woman encouraged to move around, change positions frequently, and use whatever positions felt most comfortable to her. Medieval midwives understood that movement could help labor progress more efficiently, and they encouraged women to walk, squat, or lean against supportive structures during contractions. This approach was based on centuries of practical observation rather than theoretical medical knowledge, but it aligned remarkably well with modern understanding of how to facilitate natural labor. Pain management during medieval labor relied primarily on herbal remedies, physical comfort measures, and emotional support from the attending women. Herbal preparations might include teas or tinctures made from plants like willow bark, which contains compounds similar to modern aspirin, or opium poppies, which could provide more powerful pain relief but were used sparingly due to their dangerous effects. More commonly, laboring women might be given preparations made from herbs like chamomile, lavender, or lemon balm, which were believed to have calming and pain-relieving properties. Physical comfort measures during medieval labor included the use of warm compresses applied to the lower back or abdomen, gentle massage of the laboring woman's back and limbs, and the provision of warm baths when possible. Some medieval sources describe the use of special birthing stones or crystals that were believed to ease labor pains when held or placed on the body, though the effectiveness of these remedies was likely more psychological than physical. The emotional support provided by the community of attending women was perhaps the most important form of pain management available to medieval mothers. These experienced women offered constant encouragement, shared their own birth stories, led prayers or songs, and provided the reassurance that comes from being surrounded by people who understood what the laboring woman was experiencing. This communal approach to birth support created an atmosphere of shared strength and determination that helped many women endure even difficult labors. Medieval people had various ways of trying to determine how labor was progressing and when delivery might be expected. Experienced midwives could assess progress through external observation of the woman's behavior, the timing and intensity of contractions, and physical examination when necessary. However, internal examinations were less common than they are in modern obstetrics, both because of concerns about modesty and cleanliness and because medieval midwives relied more heavily on external signs and their intuitive understanding of the labor process. The active phase of labor, when contractions became more intense and frequent, was managed with increased attention to the laboring woman's comfort and needs. Additional attendants might be summoned if the labor appeared to be particularly difficult or prolonged. Special prayers or invocations might be offered, appealing to saints who were believed to protection during childbirth. The atmosphere in the birth chamber during this phase was often quite intense, with all of the attending women focused completely on supporting the laboring mother through her ordeal. Medieval birth positions varied considerably from modern practices. While some women did give birth lying on beds, many medieval births took place with the woman in upright positions that took advantage of gravity to assist the delivery. Birth stools, which were specially designed chairs with openings that allowed babies to be born between the woman's legs, were commonly used by those who could afford them. Other women might give birth while kneeling, squatting, or standing and leaning against supportive structures. The actual moment of delivery was surrounded by special rituals and practices designed to ensure the safety of both mother and baby. As the baby's head began to appear, the midwife would often recite special prayers or incantations, sometimes while making the sign of the cross over the emerging child. The umbilical cord was typically cut using a sharp knife or special blade that had been blessed or consecrated for this purpose, and the cut was often made while invoking divine protection for the newborn. Immediately after the birth, the baby's condition was quickly assessed by the experienced midwife and her assistants. Medieval people understood many of the signs that indicated whether a newborn was healthy and likely to survive, including the color of the baby's skin, the strength of their cry, and their general responsiveness. Babies who appeared weak or sickly might receive immediate emergency baptism, as medieval people believed it was crucial for infants to be baptized before they died in order to ensure their soul's salvation. The delivery of the placenta, known in medieval times as the afterbirth, was considered a crucial final stage of the birth process. Medieval midwives understood that the placenta had to be completely expelled from the mother's body, and that retained portions could cause serious complications, including infection and bleeding. Various herbal remedies were used to encourage the delivery of the placenta, and midwives carefully examined the expelled placenta to ensure it was complete. Complications during medieval births were handled with whatever knowledge and resources were available to the attending midwives and their assistants. Breech presentations, where babies emerged feet or buttocks first instead of head first, were recognized as potentially dangerous situations that required special techniques and experienced handling. Some medieval midwives had developed considerable skill in managing breech deliveries, though the outcomes were often still poor by modern standards. Prolonged labor was another common complication that medieval midwives had to manage. When labor stretched on for many hours or even days without progress, various remedies might be attempted to speed delivery. These could include herbal preparations designed to strengthen contractions, changes in the laboring woman's position, or special prayers and rituals intended to remove whatever spiritual obstacles might be preventing the birth from proceeding normally. Hemorrhaging during or after delivery was one of the most feared complications of medieval childbirth, as it could quickly lead to the mother's death. Medieval midwives had various techniques for trying to control bleeding, including the use of herbal preparations that were believed to have blood clotting properties, the application of pressure to bleeding areas, and positioning techniques that might help the uterus contract more effectively to stop bleeding. The birth of twins or other multiple babies was considered both a blessing and a potential source of complications. Medieval people had various beliefs about twins, some considering them especially fortunate, while others viewed multiple births with suspicion or concern. The practical challenges of delivering and caring for multiple babies were considerable, and the survival rate for twins was often lower than for single babies. Medieval births often lasted much longer than modern deliveries, partly because medical interventions that can speed labor today were not available, and partly because medieval women were often already weakened by poor nutrition, frequent pregnancies, and hard physical labor. It was not uncommon for labor to last 24 hours or longer, requiring tremendous endurance from both the laboring woman and her attendants. The completion of a successful birth was marked by celebration and thanksgiving, with prayers of gratitude offered for the safe delivery of both mother and baby. However, the immediate post-birth period was also recognized as a time of continued vulnerability, when both mother and infant required careful attention and monitoring to ensure their continued health and survival. Medieval midwifery was a sophisticated system of knowledge and practice that had been developed and refined over centuries of experience. Unlike modern obstetrics, which is based on scientific research and standardized medical training, medieval midwifery was a traditional craft that was passed down from experienced practitioners to apprentices through hands-on learning and oral instruction. This system produced midwives who possessed remarkable practical skills and intuitive understanding of the birth process, even though their theoretical knowledge was based on beliefs and assumptions that we would now consider incorrect. The training of medieval midwives began early and continued throughout their careers. Young women who showed aptitude for healing or who expressed interest in attending births might be taken as apprentices by experienced midwives in their communities. This apprenticeship could last for several years and involved observing countless births, learning to recognize the signs of normal and abnormal labor, and mastering the various techniques and remedies that midwives used in their practice. Medieval midwives learned to assess pregnant women throughout their pregnancies, monitoring for signs of potential complications and providing guidance on diet, exercise, and behavior during pregnancy. They developed sophisticated abilities to determine fetal position through external examination, to predict approximately when labor might begin, and to recognize when a pregnancy was not progressing normally. This knowledge was gained entirely through direct observation and experience, as medieval midwives had no access to the diagnostic tools that modern obstetrics relies upon. The herbal knowledge possessed by medieval midwives was extensive and represented centuries of accumulated wisdom about which plants could be used safely and effectively during pregnancy and childbirth. Midwives maintained careful knowledge about when and how to harvest various medicinal plants, how to prepare them for use, and what dosages were appropriate for different situations. They understood which herbs could be used to ease morning sickness during pregnancy, which could help strengthen women during labor, and which could be used to treat complications that arose during or after birth. Some of the herbs commonly used by medieval midwives included raspberry leaf, which was believed to strengthen the uterus and ease labor, motherwort, which was used to calm anxious mothers and regulate contractions, and lady's mantle, which was applied to tears and wounds that might occur during delivery. Many of these traditional herbal remedies have been validated by modern research, though others were ineffective or even potentially harmful. Medieval midwives also possessed detailed knowledge about the normal progression of labor and delivery. They could recognize the different stages of labor, assess whether labor was progressing at an appropriate pace, and identify signs that might indicate complications were developing. This knowledge allowed them to provide appropriate support and intervention when necessary, though their options for intervention were much more limited than those available to modern medical practitioners. The diagnostic skills of medieval midwives were remarkable, considering the tools and knowledge available to them. They learned to assess fetal position and presentation through external palpation, to recognize signs of fetal distress through changes in the mother's condition, and to identify complications like placenta previa or cord prolapse through careful observation. While they couldn't always successfully treat these complications, their ability to recognize them often allowed families to prepare for difficult outcomes. Medieval midwives developed various techniques for managing difficult deliveries. When babies were in breech position, experienced midwives had methods for attempting to turn them to head-down position, though this was always risky and not always successful. They also knew techniques for assisting breech deliveries when turning wasn't possible, using careful manipulation to help guide babies safely through the birth canal. When labor failed to progress normally, medieval midwives had various approaches they could try. They might encourage the laboring woman to change positions, take walks if she was able, or try different breathing techniques that had been passed down through generations of practitioners. They also knew herbal preparations that were believed to strengthen contractions and speed delivery, though some of these remedies were dangerous and could cause more harm than good. The social status of medieval midwives varied considerably depending on their skill, experience, and the communities they served. The most skilled and experienced midwives often enjoyed considerable respect and influence within their communities. They were called upon not only to attend births, but also to provide general medical care for women and children, to serve as advisors on matters related to fertility and pregnancy, and sometimes to testify in legal proceedings involving questions of paternity or legitimacy. Some medieval midwives served wealthy families and were well compensated for their services, receiving not only payment in money or goods, but also ongoing patronage and protection from their employers. These elite midwives might travel considerable distances to attend the births of noble women, and their reputations could spread across wide geographic areas. They often had access to expensive herbs and medicines that were not available to ordinary practitioners, and they might receive special training or instruction from male physicians. At the other end of the social spectrum were midwives who served primarily poor and working-class families in their immediate communities. These women often combined midwifery with other occupations, such as brewing, textile work, or general healing, as there might not be enough births in their communities to support them as full-time midwives. Their payment often came in the form of food, goods, or services rather than money, and they typically used only those herbal remedies that could be gathered locally or prepared at home. The relationship between medieval midwives and the male-dominated medical profession was complex and sometimes contentious. While most births were attended entirely by female midwives without any involvement from male physicians, complicated cases sometimes required consultation with university-trained doctors. However, these consultations were often awkward, as male physicians were generally not permitted to examine female patients directly and had to rely on descriptions provided by the midwives. Some medieval physicians wrote treatises on obstetrics and gynecology that were intended to guide midwives in their practice. These texts often contained a mixture of useful practical advice and theoretical speculation based on classical medical authorities. However, the practical experience of working midwives often contradicted the theoretical knowledge contained in these scholarly works, creating tension between traditional female knowledge and academic male medicine. The legal status of medieval midwives was also complex and varied by time period and location. In some areas and time periods, licensing requirements, when they existed, often focused more on the moral character of the midwife than on her technical skills, reflecting medieval concerns about the potential for midwives to be involved in practices like contraception, abortion, or infanticide. In some areas and time periods, midwives were required to be licensed by church or civil authorities, while in others, they practiced without formal regulation. Licensing requirements, when they existed, often focused more on the moral character of the midwife than on her technical skills, reflecting medieval concerns about the potential for midwives to be involved in practices like contraception, abortion, or infanticide. Medieval midwives were often called upon to provide testimony in legal proceedings involving questions about birth, death, legitimacy, or paternity. Their expert knowledge was recognized by legal authorities, and their testimony could be crucial in resolving disputes about inheritance, marriage validity, or other legal matters. This legal role added to their social importance and influence within their communities. The tools and equipment used by medieval midwives were simple by modern standards, but represented centuries of practical development and refinement. Birth stools, which allowed women to give birth in upright positions while providing support and comfort, were one of the most important tools of the medieval midwife's trade. These stools were often passed down from one generation of midwives to the next and were sometimes decorated with religious symbols or protective charms. Other tools commonly used by medieval midwives included sharp knives or scissors for cutting umbilical cords, various vessels for holding water and herbal preparations, soft cloths and linens for cleaning and wrapping newborns, and collections of herbs and medicines that were essential for their practice. Some midwives also possessed special books or manuscripts containing medical knowledge, though many relied primarily on oral tradition and personal experience. The seasonal patterns of medieval life affected midwifery practice in various ways. Births tended to follow seasonal patterns related to agricultural cycles and food availability, with peak birth seasons often occurring in late summer and early fall. This meant that midwives might be extremely busy during certain times of the year and have relatively fewer births to attend during other seasons. The availability of fresh herbs and medicines also varied seasonally, requiring midwives to plan ahead and preserve medicinal plants when they were available. Medieval midwives often worked in networks that spanned multiple communities, sharing knowledge and sometimes sharing the burden of attending particularly difficult or prolonged births. Experienced midwives might be called upon to assist less experienced practitioners during complicated deliveries, and they often served as mentors and teachers for the next generation of birth attendants. The spiritual dimension of medieval midwifery was as important as the technical aspects. Many midwives saw their work as a religious calling and incorporated prayer, blessing, and other spiritual practices into their attendance at births. They might lead prayers during labor, offer blessings over newborn babies, and provide spiritual comfort to families experiencing pregnancy loss or infant death. Medieval midwives also played important roles in the immediate postpartum period, helping new mothers establish breastfeeding, monitoring for signs of infection or complications, and providing guidance on newborn care. Their knowledge extended well beyond the birth process itself to encompass the full range of maternal and infant health concerns that arose in the weeks and months following delivery. The reputation of individual midwives was built over many years of successful practice and was crucial to their ability to earn a living from their work. Midwives who were associated with good outcomes and who were known for their skill and compassion could build practices that extended across wide geographic areas. Conversely, midwives who experienced a series of poor outcomes or who were suspected of incompetence or malicious intent could find themselves ostracized from their communities. Medieval midwifery practice was also influenced by broader cultural and religious beliefs about women, sexuality, and childbirth. Midwives had to navigate complex social expectations about female modesty, religious requirements about birth and baptism, and community beliefs about the causes of birth complications or infant mortality. This required not only technical skill, but also considerable social and diplomatic ability. The post-birth period in medieval times was recognized as a critical time that required special attention and care for both mother and baby. Unlike the modern practice of brief hospital stays followed by outpatient care, medieval post-birth care took place entirely within the home and relied on the knowledge and support of family members, community women, and traditional healers. This period, often referred to as lying in, could last anywhere from a few days to several weeks, depending on the family's circumstances and the condition of mother and baby. Immediately following the birth, the new mother entered a period of confinement that was both practically necessary and culturally mandated. Medieval people understood that women needed time to recover from the physical ordeal of childbirth, and they also believed that new mothers were in a spiritually vulnerable state that required special protection and purification rituals. During this period, new mothers were typically confined to their bedchambers and were cared for by female relatives, friends, and servants. The physical care of new mothers during the lying-in period focused on promoting healing, preventing complications, and gradually restoring strength. New mothers were encouraged to rest as much as possible, though complete bed rest was often not feasible for women who had other children to care for or essential household duties to manage. The diet of new mothers was carefully regulated according to medieval medical theory, with emphasis placed on foods that were believed to promote healing and support milk production. Broth made from chicken or other poultry was considered especially beneficial for new mothers, as were various herbal teas and preparations believed to have strengthening properties. Foods that were considered too rich, spicy, or difficult to digest were typically avoided during the early postpartum period. The quality and quantity of food available to new mothers varied greatly depending on their social and economic status, with wealthy women having access to special delicacies and imported ingredients, while poor women often had to make do with simple porridges and whatever foods their families could afford. The establishment of breastfeeding was recognized as crucial for infant survival, and considerable attention was paid to helping new mothers successfully nurse their babies. Medieval people understood that breast milk was the ideal food for infants, and they had developed various techniques for addressing common breastfeeding problems such as sore nipples, insufficient milk supply, or babies who had difficulty learning to nurse. When breastfeeding was not possible or successful, medieval families faced the challenge of finding alternative feeding methods for their infants. Wet nurses, women who could provide breast milk for babies other than their own, were employed by families who could afford their services. The selection of a wet nurse was considered extremely important, as medieval people believed that the character and qualities of the wet nurse would be transmitted to the baby along with her milk. For families who could not afford wet nurses, alternative feeding methods had to be devised. These might include feeding infants with animal milk, usually from goats or cows, delivered through various improvised feeding devices. However, these alternative feeding methods were much less successful than breastfeeding, and infants fed on animal milk had significantly higher mortality rates than those who were breastfed. The spiritual care of new mothers was considered as important as their physical care. Medieval Christianity taught that women became ritually unclean through the process of childbirth and required special purification rituals before they could fully participate in religious life again. This belief was based on Old Testament teachings about ritual purity and was reinforced by medieval interpretations of Christian doctrine. The churching ceremony, also known as the purification of women after childbirth, was an important ritual that marked the end of the lying-in period and the new mother's return to normal social and religious participation. This ceremony typically took place several weeks after the birth and involved special prayers, blessings, and sometimes the offering of candles or other gifts to the church. The timing of the churching ceremony was based on biblical precedents, with 40 days being the traditional period for purification after the birth of a son and 80 days after the birth of a daughter. During the lying-in period, new mothers received visitors from their communities, including female relatives, friends, and neighbors, who came to offer congratulations, support, and practical assistance. These visits were important social events that helped integrate the new baby into the community and provided emotional support for the new mother. However, visitors were also expected to follow certain protocols and customs, such as bringing small gifts for the baby or contributions of food for the family. The care of newborn babies during the medieval period was based on centuries of traditional knowledge about infant needs and development. Newborns were typically swaddled tightly in cloth wrappings that were believed to help their limbs grow straight and strong. This swaddling was usually maintained for several months, with babies being unwrapped only for cleaning and feeding. Medieval people had various beliefs about how to protect newborn babies from harm, both physical and spiritual. Babies were often blessed immediately after birth and might wear protective amulets or have special prayers said over them. Iron objects were sometimes placed near babies' cradles, as iron was believed to protection against evil spirits and malevolent influences. The naming of babies was an important decision that often involved complex family and religious considerations. Children were frequently named after saints, family members, or religious figures, and the choice of name was believed to influence the child's character and future prospects. Baptism usually took place within a few days of birth, as medieval people believed that unbaptized babies who died would be denied entry to heaven. The monitoring of newborn health was a constant concern during the medieval period, given the high rates of infant mortality. Experienced women in the community, including midwives and female relatives, carefully watched for signs that babies were thriving or failing. They knew how to recognize the symptoms of various infant ailments and had traditional remedies for common problems such as colic, feeding difficulties, or skin rashes. Sleep arrangements for medieval babies varied depending on family circumstances and social class. Wealthy families might have specially constructed cradles for their infants, often elaborately decorated and sometimes equipped with rockers or other mechanisms to help soothe fussy babies. Poor families typically had their infants sleep in simple baskets or boxes, or sometimes in the same beds as their parents, though this practice was recognized as potentially dangerous. The gradual recovery of new mothers was monitored carefully by the women attending them during the lying-in period. Signs of infection, excessive bleeding, or other complications were watched for constantly, as these could quickly become life-threatening in an era without modern medical interventions. Traditional remedies were applied when problems arose, though the effectiveness of these treatments was limited by the medical knowledge available at the time. The length of the lying-in period varied considerably, depending on the circumstances of individual families. Wealthy women might remain confined for several weeks or even months, cared for by servants and attended by experienced matrons. Poor women, on the other hand, often had to resume their regular work activities within a few days of giving birth, as their families could not survive without their labor. The transition from the lying-in period back to normal activities within a few days of giving birth, as their families could not survive without their labor. The transition from the lying-in period back to normal activities was gradual and often marked by specific rituals or ceremonies. In addition to the religious churching ceremony, there might be social gatherings or celebrations to mark the new mother's return to full participation in community life. These events provided opportunities for the community to welcome the new baby and to acknowledge the successful completion of the childbirth process. The care of other children in the family during the post-birth period required special attention and organization. Medieval families typically had multiple children, and the arrival of a new baby often meant that older siblings had to take on additional responsibilities or be cared for by relatives or neighbors. This redistribution of family roles and responsibilities was a normal part of medieval family life, but it could create challenges and stresses that affected the entire household. The economic impact of a new birth on medieval families was significant and had to be carefully managed during the post-birth period. The costs associated with childbirth, including payment for midwifery services, special foods and medicines, and time lost from productive work, could strain family resources. At the same time, new babies represented both additional mouths to feed and, eventually, additional workers to contribute to family enterprises. Medieval families also had to plan for the religious and social obligations associated with new births, including arrangements for baptism ceremonies, churching rituals, and various social celebrations. These events often required considerable expenditure and planning, but they were considered essential for properly welcoming new children into both the family and the broader community. Infant care in medieval times was shaped by high mortality rates, limited medical knowledge, and traditional beliefs about child development and protection. Medieval parents loved their children just as deeply as parents today, but they had to navigate the harsh reality that many babies did not survive their first year of life. This knowledge influenced every aspect of how infants were cared for, from daily routines to long-term planning for the child's future. The feeding of medieval infants was primarily dependent on successful breastfeeding, which was recognized as crucial for infant survival. Medieval people understood that breast milk provided the best nutrition for babies, and considerable effort was devoted to ensuring that new mothers could successfully nurse their children. When breastfeeding problems arose, various traditional remedies were employed to address issues such as insufficient milk production, mastitis, or difficulty with the baby's ability to latch and feed effectively. Medieval mothers who were unable to breastfeed their own babies faced difficult choices about alternative feeding arrangements. Wealthy families might hire wet nurses, carefully selected women who could provide breast milk for babies other than their own. The selection process for wet nurses was quite detailed, with attention paid not only to the woman's ability to produce adequate milk, but also to her moral character, health, and temperament, as medieval people believed these qualities would be transmitted to the nursing infant. For families who could not afford wet nurses, feeding infants became much more challenging and dangerous. Various forms of animal milk might be used, typically from goats, cows, or sheep, but these alternatives were much less nutritious than human milk and often led to digestive problems and increased mortality rates. The delivery methods for alternative milk sources were also problematic, often involving improvised feeding devices that were difficult to keep clean and could harbor dangerous bacteria. Medieval people developed various supplementary foods that might be given to older infants, typically beginning at several months of age. These might include thin gruels made from grains, broths, and pre-chewed foods that adults would masticate before feeding to babies. However, the introduction of solid foods to medieval infants was fraught with danger, as many foods that adults could tolerate safely were too difficult for immature digestive systems to process. The sleep patterns and arrangements for medieval infants reflected both practical necessities and beliefs about child safety and development. Many babies slept with their parents in the family bed, particularly in poor households where separate sleeping spaces were not available. However, this practice was recognized as potentially dangerous, as babies could be accidentally smothered or injured during sleep. Cradles and other infant sleeping arrangements varied widely depending on family wealth and local customs. Wealthy families might have elaborate wooden cradles, sometimes fitted with rockers and decorated with religious symbols or family emblems. These cradles often became family heirlooms, passed down through generations. Poor families typically improvised sleeping arrangements using baskets, boxes, or simple wooden constructions. Medieval beliefs about infant development influenced many aspects of daily care. The practice of swaddling, which involved wrapping babies tightly in cloth bindings, was nearly universal and was believed to help ensure that the child's limbs would grow straight and strong. Swaddling was typically maintained for the first several months of life, with babies being unwrapped only for cleaning, feeding, and brief periods of movement. The bathing and cleaning of medieval infants was approached with considerable caution, as water was often scarce and of questionable cleanliness, and exposure to cold was believed to be dangerous for babies. When baths were given, they were typically brief and conducted with warmed water, often infused with herbs believed to have protective or strengthening properties. More commonly, babies were cleaned with damp cloths or sponges rather than being fully immersed in water. Medieval parents and caregivers watched constantly for signs of illness or developmental problems in their infants. They had developed considerable expertise in recognizing the symptoms of common infant ailments and had traditional remedies for many problems. However, their understanding of disease causation was based on theories that we would now consider incorrect, such as the belief that illness could be caused by exposure to evil influences, imbalances in bodily humors, or divine punishment for parental sins. The spiritual protection of medieval infants was considered as important as their physical care. Babies were typically baptized within a few days of birth, as medieval people believed that unbaptized children who died would be denied entry to heaven. The urgency of baptism meant that arrangements had to be made quickly after birth, often involving the local priest and godparents who would take responsibility for the child's spiritual education. Various protective objects and rituals were employed to safeguard medieval infants from spiritual and physical harm. These might include religious medals or relics placed in or near the baby's sleeping area, special prayers or blessings recited over the child, and protective charms or amulets believed to ward off evil influences. Iron objects were particularly favored for infant protection, as iron was believed to repel malevolent spirits and supernatural threats. The social integration of medieval infants into their communities began early and involved various customs and ceremonies. Visitors would come to see new babies and offer blessings, gifts, or predictions about the child's future. These social interactions were important for establishing the baby's place within the community and for building networks of support that might be crucial for the child's survival and development. Medieval parents had to make early decisions about their children's futures, often based on factors such as birth order, family economic circumstances, and perceived abilities or characteristics. These decisions might influence everything from the child's education and training to eventual marriage arrangements or religious vocations. The high mortality rates meant that parents often had to revise these plans repeatedly as children either thrived or failed to survive. The seasonal patterns of medieval life affected infant care in various ways. Babies born during certain times of the year faced different challenges and advantages depending on factors such as food availability, weather conditions, and the prevalence of various diseases. Winter births meant that babies would face their most vulnerable early months during cold weather when food might be scarce, while summer births offered advantages in terms of warmth and food availability, but might coincide with seasonal epidemics. Medieval beliefs about child development included various theories about when different capabilities would emerge and how parents could encourage healthy development. These beliefs influenced decisions about when to begin various activities, such as sitting, walking, or talking, and guided parental responses to developmental milestones or delays. The naming of medieval children was a complex process that involved family traditions, religious considerations, and beliefs about the influence of names on character and destiny. Children were often named after saints, family members, or important religious or historical figures, and the choice of name was believed to provide protection and guidance throughout the child's life. Medieval families also had to plan for the economic and social implications of raising children, including costs for food, clothing, education, and eventual marriage or career arrangements. These considerations were particularly important for families with limited resources, who might have to make difficult choices about which children would receive priority in terms of investment and support. The care of medieval infants required constant vigilance and attention from parents and other family members, as the margin for error was much smaller than it is today. Small problems that might be easily resolved with modern medical care could quickly become life-threatening situations, requiring medieval caregivers to be constantly alert to changes in their baby's condition and behavior. The social class distinctions that permeated medieval society profoundly influenced every aspect of pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care. These differences extended far beyond simple matters of wealth and poverty to encompass fundamentally different experiences, expectations, and outcomes for women and children born into different social strata. Understanding these class-based variations provides crucial insight into how medieval society functioned and how social hierarchies shaped even the most intimate aspects of human life. Noble and aristocratic women experienced pregnancy and childbirth in circumstances that were dramatically different from those of peasant or working-class women. Wealthy women had access to better nutrition throughout their pregnancies, consuming diets that included meat, dairy products, fruits, vegetables, and imported spices that were far beyond the reach of ordinary people. This better nutrition contributed to healthier pregnancies and improved outcomes for both mothers and babies, though even wealthy women faced significant risks during childbirth. The living conditions of noble women also provided advantages during pregnancy and the postpartum period. Large manor houses and castles offered private chambers where births could take place away from the chaos and noise of daily household activities. These spaces could be properly heated, well lit, and maintained in cleaner conditions than were possible in peasant cottages. Wealthy women also had access to better bedding, clothing, and other comfort items that could make the experience of pregnancy and recovery more bearable. Aristocratic women typically had access to the most skilled and experienced midwives, who might travel considerable distances to attend important births. These elite midwives often had extensive experience serving wealthy families and had access to expensive herbs, medicines, and equipment that were not available to ordinary practitioners. They might also have received special training or instruction from male physicians, giving them additional knowledge and skills. The lying-in period for wealthy women could extend for weeks or even months, during which they were cared for by servants, relatives, and hired attendants. This extended recovery period allowed aristocratic women to fully heal from childbirth before resuming their normal activities, which contributed to better health outcomes and reduced the risk of complications. During this time, wealthy women might receive visitors, enjoy special foods and entertainments, and participate in elaborate social rituals surrounding the new birth. Noble families could afford to hire wet nurses when breastfeeding was not possible or desired, providing their infants with the best possible alternative to maternal nursing. The selection process for aristocratic wet nurses was quite elaborate, with careful attention paid to the woman's health, character, moral reputation, and ability to produce adequate milk. Some noble families maintained wet nurses as permanent household staff, ensuring that trained caregivers would be immediately available when needed. The spiritual and religious aspects of birth were also more elaborate among the aristocracy. Noble families could afford private chaplains, special religious ceremonies, and expensive religious objects that were believed to provide protection during pregnancy and childbirth. They might commission special prayers or masses to be said for successful births, and could make generous donations to churches and monasteries in exchange for spiritual support. In contrast, peasant and working-class women faced pregnancy and childbirth under much more challenging circumstances. Poor nutrition during pregnancy was a constant concern, as peasant diets consisted primarily of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat and dairy products being rare luxuries. This nutritional deficiency contributed to higher rates of complications during pregnancy and childbirth, and increased the risks for both mothers and babies. The living conditions of poor women created additional challenges during pregnancy and birth. Most peasant families lived in single-room cottages that they shared not only with their children, but often with their livestock as well. Privacy was virtually impossible, and maintaining cleanliness was an ongoing struggle. Heating was provided by central fires that posed safety risks and often filled living spaces with smoke. These conditions made managing pregnancy, labor, and recovery much more difficult and dangerous. Peasant women typically continued working in fields, gardens, and households until very close to their delivery dates, as their families could not survive without their labor. This continuing physical stress during pregnancy may have contributed to higher rates of complications and poorer outcomes. Similarly, poor women usually had to resume work activities within days of giving birth, as their families could not afford extended recovery periods. The midwifery care available to poor women was often provided by local women who combined birth attendance with other occupations, such as brewing, textile work, or general healing. While these midwives might be experienced and skilled, they typically had access only to locally available herbs and remedies, and could not afford the expensive medicines and equipment that were available to elite practitioners. Peasant families often could not afford to hire wet nurses when breastfeeding failed, forcing them to rely on dangerous alternatives such as animal milk or improvised feeding methods. These alternatives had much higher failure rates and contributed to increased infant mortality among the poor. Poor families also had to make difficult decisions about resource allocation when multiple children needed care, sometimes prioritizing healthier or more promising children over those who seemed less likely to survive. Urban working-class families faced yet another set of circumstances that differed from both rural peasants and rural nobility. City dwellers often had somewhat better access to medical care and might be able to afford more skilled midwives, but they also faced unique challenges such as crowded living conditions, pollution, and exposure to epidemic diseases that spread rapidly through dense populations. Merchant families occupied a middle position in medieval society and experienced childbirth circumstances that reflected their intermediate status. Successful merchants might be able to afford some of the advantages enjoyed by the nobility, such as better nutrition, more comfortable living conditions, and access to skilled medical care. However, they typically lacked the extensive support networks and elaborate rituals that surrounded aristocratic births. The guild system in medieval cities created another layer of social distinction that affected birth experiences. Women married to master craftsmen might have access to guild-sponsored support systems, including financial assistance during lying-in periods and access to guild-affiliated midwives or medical practitioners. Apprentices and journeymen, on the other hand, often lacked these support systems and faced economic pressures similar to those experienced by poor agricultural workers. Religious communities offered an entirely different model for women's experiences of childbirth, though nuns and other religious women were generally expected to remain celibate. However, religious institutions often played important roles in providing medical care and support for women in their surrounding communities, particularly through infirmaries and charitable activities that served poor women. The legal protections and rights available to women during pregnancy and childbirth also varied significantly by social class. Noble women might have marriage contracts that specified provisions for their care during pregnancy and guaranteed support for their children. They also had better access to legal representation if disputes arose about inheritance, legitimacy, or other matters related to childbirth. Poor women, on the other hand, had few legal protections and were vulnerable to exploitation or abandonment during their most vulnerable periods. The cultural expectations surrounding pregnancy and childbirth differed markedly between social classes. Aristocratic women were expected to produce male heirs to continue family lines and political alliances, creating enormous pressure around successful births. The birth of sons was celebrated with elaborate ceremonies and festivities, while the birth of daughters, though still welcomed, was often seen as less significant. Poor women faced different pressures, as additional children represented both additional mouths to feed and potential sources of labor for family enterprises. The education and knowledge available to women about pregnancy and childbirth also varied by social class. Noble women might have access to medical texts, advice from educated physicians, and knowledge gained from other aristocratic women. Poor women relied primarily on oral tradition and the accumulated wisdom of local communities, though this traditional knowledge was often quite sophisticated and effective. The seasonal patterns that affected all medieval births had different implications for families of different social classes. Wealthy families could better afford to maintain adequate nutrition and heating during difficult winter months, while poor families often struggled to provide basic necessities regardless of when births occurred. The timing of agricultural seasons also affected poor families differently than wealthy ones, as peasant women needed to balance the demands of pregnancy and childcare with essential work activities. Regional variations in medieval society created additional layers of complexity in birth experiences across different social classes. Areas with different legal systems might offer different advantages or challenges for women of various social backgrounds. Trade routes and commercial centers might provide opportunities for some families to improve their circumstances, while isolated rural areas might limit options regardless of social status. The long-term implications of class differences in birth experiences extended far beyond the immediate postpartum period. Children born into different social classes faced vastly different prospects for survival, education, and advancement. These early differences in care and circumstances often established patterns that would influence individuals throughout their entire lives, perpetuating social hierarchies across generations. Medieval medical knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth represented a fascinating synthesis of classical Greek and Roman texts, Islamic medical scholarship, Christian religious teachings, and centuries of accumulated practical experience. This complex body of knowledge guided the understanding and treatment of pregnancy-related conditions, though much of it was based on theoretical frameworks that we would now consider scientifically incorrect. Nevertheless, medieval medical practitioners developed remarkably sophisticated approaches to many aspects of reproductive health and childbirth care. The theoretical foundation of medieval obstetrics was largely derived from the works of ancient authorities, particularly Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Galen. These classical texts provided frameworks for understanding female anatomy, the process of conception, fetal development, and the mechanism of childbirth. Medieval scholars translated, copied, and commented extensively on these ancient works, often adding their own observations and interpretations to create new syntheses of medical knowledge. One of the most influential concepts in medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this theory, health depended on maintaining the proper balance among these four substances, while disease resulted from humoral imbalances. This framework was applied extensively to understanding pregnancy and childbirth, with different stages of pregnancy and various complications being attributed to specific humoral imbalances that could theoretically be corrected through appropriate treatments. Medieval physicians believed that women were naturally colder and moister than men, a humoral characteristic that was thought to make them more emotional, less rational, and more prone to certain types of illness. This theoretical framework profoundly influenced how pregnancy was understood, as the process of carrying and delivering a child was seen as particularly challenging for the inherently weaker female constitution. Pregnancy was often viewed as a condition that further destabilized women's already precarious humoral balance. The medieval understanding of conception was based on ancient theories that combined accurate observations with incorrect assumptions about reproductive physiology. Medieval authorities generally accepted the idea that both men and women contributed material substances to conception, though they disagreed about the relative importance of male and female contributions. Some medieval texts described female orgasm as necessary for conception, while others focused primarily on male contributions to the reproductive process. Fetal development was understood through a combination of classical embryological theories and direct observation of miscarried or stillborn fetuses. Medieval medical texts often included detailed descriptions of fetal development at different stages of pregnancy, some of which were remarkably accurate, while others were based on theoretical speculation. The concept that the fetus passed through different developmental stages, each with its own characteristics and vulnerabilities, influenced approaches to prenatal care and the treatment of pregnancy complications. Medieval physicians developed elaborate systems for predicting and calculating due dates, often incorporating astrological considerations alongside more practical observations. The timing of conception was thought to influence not only the length of pregnancy, but also the characteristics and future prospects of the resulting child. Some medieval medical texts included complex charts and calculations for determining optimal times for conception and predicting birth outcomes based on astrological factors. The medieval understanding of labor and delivery was based on careful observation of the birth process, combined with theoretical frameworks derived from classical medical authorities. Medieval physicians recognized that labor typically progressed through distinct stages and understood many of the signs that indicated normal versus problematic deliveries. They developed detailed descriptions of various fetal presentations and had specific techniques for managing difficult types of difficult births. Pain during childbirth was understood within the framework of Christian theology, which attributed labor pains to divine punishment for Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden. However, medieval medical practitioners also recognized that excessive pain could be dangerous and developed various approaches to pain management that combined religious practices with practical medical interventions. The balance between accepting divinely ordained suffering and providing appropriate medical relief was a constant tension in medieval obstetric practice. Medieval medical texts included extensive information about herbal remedies and other treatments for pregnancy-related conditions. These pharmacological approaches were based on the theory that different substances had specific effects on bodily humors and could be used to correct imbalances that led to complications. Some of these herbal remedies have been validated by modern research, while others were ineffective or potentially dangerous. The medieval medical understanding of postpartum complications was quite sophisticated in some areas and lacking in others. Medieval physicians recognized many of the signs of postpartum infection, excessive bleeding, and other serious complications, and they had developed specific treatments for these conditions. However, their understanding of disease causation was limited by their theoretical frameworks, which attributed many complications to humoral imbalances rather than to bacterial infections or other factors that we now know to be important. Medieval medical education was primarily available to men and was conducted in universities and other formal institutions. This meant that the most advanced theoretical medical knowledge was generally not directly accessible to the female midwives who actually attended most births. However, there was considerable informal exchange of knowledge between male physicians and female practitioners, and some medieval medical texts were specifically written to guide midwives in their practice. The integration of medical knowledge with religious beliefs was a constant feature of medieval medicine. Medieval physicians saw no contradiction between using natural remedies and appealing to divine intervention for healing. Medical treatments were often accompanied by prayers, blessings, and other religious practices, and the success or failure of medical interventions was frequently attributed to divine will rather than to the effectiveness of specific treatments. Islamic medical knowledge had a profound influence on medieval European medicine, particularly through the works of physicians like Avicenna and Rhazes. Islamic medical texts contained sophisticated discussions of obstetrics and gynecology that were translated into Latin and incorporated into European medical education. This Islamic influence brought new theoretical perspectives and practical techniques to European medical practice, though it also sometimes conflicted with Christian religious teachings. Medieval medical knowledge was preserved and transmitted through various institutions, including monasteries, universities, and the personal libraries of wealthy physicians and scholars. Medical manuscripts were copied by hand, often with additional commentary and illustration that reflected the experiences and observations of individual practitioners. This manuscript tradition created a complex web of medical knowledge that varied considerably from one region or institution to another. The practical application of medieval medical knowledge was often limited by the availability of materials and equipment needed for specific treatments. Even when physicians knew theoretically how to treat certain conditions, they might not have access to the necessary herbs, instruments, or other resources. This meant that medieval medical practice often required considerable improvisation and adaptation based on local circumstances and available resources. Religious influences on medieval childbirth were profound and pervasive, shaping every aspect of the experience from conception through the postpartum period. The Christian Church's teachings about sexuality, marriage, pregnancy, and childbirth provided the theological framework within which medieval people understood and approached reproduction, while also influencing practical aspects of prenatal care, labor management, and postpartum recovery. The biblical account of Eve's disobedience in the Garden of Eden provided the fundamental theological explanation for why women experienced pain during childbirth. The passage from Genesis stating that women would bring forth children in sorrow was interpreted literally by medieval theologians and provided the religious justification for viewing labor pains as divinely ordained punishment for original sin. This theological framework created complex attitudes toward pain relief during childbirth, as some religious authorities argued that attempting to reduce labor pains was contrary to God's will. However, the practical realities of caring for laboring women meant that most medieval communities developed approaches that balanced theological concerns with compassionate care. While the suffering of childbirth was understood to be spiritually meaningful, most religious authorities also recognized that excessive pain could be dangerous and that appropriate medical care was compatible with Christian teachings. This balance was achieved through emphasizing patience, faith, and acceptance of God's will while still providing practical comfort and medical assistance. The institution of marriage was central to Christian teachings about sexuality and reproduction, and medieval church doctrine strongly emphasized that childbearing should occur only within the context of legitimate marriage. This religious framework influenced social attitudes toward pregnancy and childbirth, with married women receiving community support and celebration for their pregnancies, while unmarried women faced condemnation and often harsh treatment. Pregnancy was generally viewed as a blessing from God and a fulfillment of women's divinely ordained role as mothers and nurturers. Fertile marriages were seen as signs of divine favor, while childlessness was often interpreted as an indication of spiritual problems or divine displeasure. This religious perspective created enormous social pressure on married couples to produce children, and particularly to produce male heirs who could continue family lines and inherit property. The timing of conception was influenced by religious calendar restrictions that prohibited sexual activity during certain periods of the church year. Lent, Advent, and various feast days were designated as times when married couples should abstain from sexual relations, which created seasonal patterns in conception and birth rates. These religious restrictions also meant that some pregnancies were planned around religious observances, and that the timing of births often reflected the liturgical calendar. Prayer and religious devotion played crucial roles throughout pregnancy, with expectant mothers encouraged to maintain regular spiritual practices and to appeal to various saints for protection and assistance. Saint Margaret of Antioch was particularly popular among pregnant women, as she was believed to provide special protection during childbirth. Her feast day was celebrated with special devotions, and many pregnant women wore medals or carried relics associated with her. The Virgin Mary served as the ultimate model of blessed motherhood in medieval Christian culture, and her example influenced attitudes toward pregnancy and childbirth. However, the theological doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity and her exemption from the pain of childbirth due to her sinless nature created some tension, as ordinary women could not hope to achieve Mary's perfect example. Nevertheless, prayers to Mary for protection during childbirth were extremely common, and many birth chambers contained images or statues of the Virgin and Child. Religious rituals and blessings were integrated into every stage of the childbirth process. Special prayers might be said over the birth chamber before labor began, and religious objects such as holy relics, blessed candles, or sacred texts might be placed in the room to provide spiritual protection. During labor itself, attending women often led prayers or recited religious texts, and the moment of birth might be marked with specific religious invocations or blessings. The practice of emergency baptism reflected the urgent spiritual concerns that surrounded medieval childbirth. If a baby appeared unlikely to survive, religious doctrine required that baptism be administered immediately to ensure the infant's soul could enter heaven. This practice was so important that midwives were trained to perform emergency baptisms when priests were not available, and special provisions were made for baptizing babies who died during delivery. The churching ceremony, also known as the purification of women after childbirth, was one of the most important religious rituals associated with medieval birth. Based on Old Testament purification laws and the example of Mary's presentation in the temple, this ceremony marked the new mother's transition from a state of ritual impurity back to full participation in religious and social life. The timing of churching was carefully regulated, typically occurring 40 days after the birth of a son or 80 days after the birth of a daughter. The churching ceremony involves special prayers, blessings, and often the offering of candles or other gifts to the church. New mothers dressed in their finest clothes and were accompanied by female relatives and friends who participated in the celebration of successful childbirth and recovery. The ceremony served both religious and social functions, marking the end of the lying-in period and the woman's return to normal community participation. Religious calendar celebrations often coincided with or influenced birth-related customs and practices. The Feast of the Holy Innocents, commemorating the children killed by Herod, was a time for special prayers for child welfare and protection. The Feast of the Purification of Mary provided an annual celebration of the churching ceremony and maternal purification. Various saints' days were associated with specific aspects of pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care. Monastic communities played important roles in preserving and transmitting medical knowledge related to pregnancy and childbirth. Monasteries and convents often maintained infirmaries where medical care was provided to both religious communities and surrounding populations. Female religious communities were particularly important as repositories of women's medical knowledge, including expertise in herbal medicine and midwifery practices. The copying and preservation of medical manuscripts in monastic scriptoriums ensured that important medical knowledge about pregnancy and childbirth was maintained and transmitted across generations. Many of the most important medieval medical texts dealing with obstetrics and gynecology were preserved in religious institutions, where they were copied, studied, and sometimes expanded with additional commentary and observations. Religious teachings about the nature of women and their role in society profoundly influenced attitudes toward pregnancy and childbirth. The concept of women as naturally weaker, more emotional, and more prone to temptation than men was reinforced by theological interpretations of biblical texts. These beliefs influenced medical care, legal rights, and social expectations surrounding pregnancy and motherhood. The theological emphasis on women's primary role as mothers and nurturers meant that successful childbearing was viewed as the fulfillment of female destiny and divine purpose. Women who died in childbirth were sometimes viewed as martyrs who had sacrificed their lives in service to God's plan for human reproduction. This theological framework provided some comfort to families who lost wives and mothers in childbirth, though it also reinforced social pressures on women to bear children regardless of personal risk. Religious charitable institutions often provided support for poor women during pregnancy and childbirth. Hospitals run by religious orders sometimes offered care for indigent mothers, and religious charitable foundations might provide food, clothing, or other assistance to families during the expensive and vulnerable periods surrounding birth. These religious charitable activities were seen as expressions of Christian duty and helped ensure that even poor women had some access to assistance during childbirth. The integration of religious and medical practices in medieval childbirth care created a holistic approach that addressed both spiritual and physical needs. Herbal remedies were often blessed before use, medical procedures might be accompanied by prayers, and healing was understood to depend on both natural remedies and divine intervention. This integration reflected medieval people's understanding that spiritual and physical health were intimately connected and that successful medical care required attention to both dimensions. Religious pilgrimage was another important aspect of medieval reproductive culture, with many couples making pilgrimages to seek divine assistance with fertility problems or to give thanks for successful births. Popular pilgrimage destinations included shrines dedicated to saints associated with fertility and childbirth, and some couples traveled considerable distances to visit these holy sites in hopes of conceiving children or ensuring safe deliveries. The concept of divine providence played a central role in how medieval people understood the outcomes of pregnancy and childbirth. Successful births were attributed to God's blessing and favor, while pregnancy losses, stillbirths, and maternal deaths were often seen as expressions of divine will that had to be accepted with patience and faith. This theological framework provided a way of making sense of the high mortality rates associated with medieval childbirth, though it also sometimes discouraged efforts to improve medical care or prevent complications. Religious education and moral instruction were considered essential preparations for marriage and motherhood, with young women receiving instruction in Christian doctrine, proper behavior, and their duties as wives and mothers. This religious preparation was seen as necessary for ensuring that women would approach marriage and childbearing with appropriate spiritual attitudes and moral understanding. Complications during medieval childbirth were both feared and common, representing some of the most dangerous situations that women and their families faced. Without modern medical interventions, surgical techniques, or pharmaceutical options, medieval communities had to rely on traditional knowledge, herbal remedies, and prayer to address the various problems that could arise during pregnancy, labor, and delivery. The management of these complications required considerable skill and experience from midwives and other attendants, though outcomes were often poor despite their best efforts. Prolonged labor was one of the most common and dangerous complications encountered in medieval childbirth. When labor extended for many hours or even days without significant progress, both mother and baby were at serious risk. Medieval midwives had developed various approaches to managing prolonged labor, including encouraging changes in maternal position, providing strengthening foods and drinks, and administering herbal preparations believed to stimulate more effective contractions. Some of the herbal remedies used for prolonged labor included ergot, a fungus that grows on grains and contains compounds that can stimulate powerful uterine contractions. However, ergot was extremely dangerous and could cause severe complications, including hemorrhaging, convulsions, and death if used incorrectly. Other herbs commonly used to speed labor included pennyroyal, savin, and various preparations made from roots and bark that were believed to have stimulating properties. When herbal remedies and position changes failed to resolve prolonged labor, medieval midwives might resort to more dramatic interventions. These could include vigorous massage of the abdomen, attempts to manually reposition the baby, or procedures designed to rupture the membranes surrounding the fetus. These interventions were risky and often unsuccessful, but they represented the limits of what medieval practitioners could attempt when faced with obstructed labor. Breech presentations, where babies emerged feet or buttocks first instead of head first, were recognized as particularly dangerous situations that required special expertise to manage safely. Experienced midwives had techniques for attempting to turn breech babies to head-down positions, though this procedure was extremely risky and was not always successful. When turning attempts failed, midwives had to manage breech deliveries using careful techniques to avoid injury to both mother and baby. The delivery of breech babies required considerable skill and experience, as the risk of complications was much higher than with normal head-down presentations. Medieval midwives learned techniques for supporting the baby's body during delivery, managing the emergence of the head, and dealing with complications such as cord prolapse or shoulder impaction. However, even skilled management of breech deliveries often resulted in poor outcomes, with high rates of infant and maternal mortality. Hemorrhaging during or after delivery was perhaps the most feared complication of medieval childbirth, as severe bleeding could quickly lead to maternal death. Medieval midwives had various approaches to managing hemorrhage, including the use of herbal preparations believed to promote blood clotting, the application of pressure to bleeding areas, and positioning techniques designed to encourage uterine contraction and control bleeding. Some of the herbal remedies used for hemorrhage control included preparations made from plants like shepherd's purse, witch hazel, and various fungi that were believed to have blood clotting properties. Cold applications might also be used, as medieval practitioners understood that cold could help constrict blood vessels and reduce bleeding. However, severe hemorrhaging often overwhelmed these traditional remedies, and many women died from blood loss despite intensive efforts to save them. Retained placenta was another serious complication that medieval midwives had to manage. When the placenta failed to deliver naturally after the birth of the baby, manual removal was often necessary to prevent infection and bleeding. This procedure was extremely dangerous in an era without antiseptic techniques or antibiotics, as it often led to serious infections that could prove fatal. Medieval midwives developed techniques for manually removing retained placentas, but these procedures required considerable courage and skill as they were performed without anesthesia and carried enormous risks. The midwife would have to insert her hand into the uterus to locate and separate the placenta, a procedure that was not only painful for the mother, but also posed significant risks of introducing infection or causing additional bleeding. Infections following childbirth were common and often fatal in medieval times, as the connection between cleanliness and disease prevention was not fully understood. Women who developed fevers, unusual discharge, or other signs of infection after delivery often died within days or weeks, despite the best efforts of their caregivers. Medieval practitioners had some herbal remedies that may have had antibacterial properties, but these were generally insufficient to treat serious postpartum infections. The management of postpartum infections relied heavily on herbal preparations, dietary modifications, and prayer, as medieval people had no understanding of bacterial causation or effective antibacterial treatments. Women with infections might be given strengthening broths, herbal teas believed to have purifying properties, and preparations designed to balance their bodily humors. However, these treatments were largely ineffective against serious bacterial infections. Eclampsia and other pregnancy-related seizure disorders were poorly understood in medieval times and were often attributed to supernatural causes or spiritual problems. Women who developed seizures during pregnancy or childbirth were sometimes thought to be possessed by evil spirits or to be suffering from divine punishment for sins. The medical treatments available for seizure disorders were limited and often ineffective, consisting primarily of herbal sedatives and religious interventions. Multiple births, particularly twins or triplets, were considered both blessed and problematic in medieval times. While multiple babies were often seen as signs of divine favor, the practical challenges of delivering and caring for multiple infants were enormous. The physical demands of delivering multiple babies often led to complications such as prolonged labor, hemorrhaging, and exhaustion that put both mothers and babies at risk. The management of twin deliveries required special skills and experience, as the positioning and presentation of multiple babies could create complex problems during delivery. Medieval midwives had to be prepared for various scenarios, including the possibility that one baby might be in breech position while the other was head down, or that the babies might become entangled during delivery. Stillbirth and neonatal death were tragically common in medieval times, with many babies dying during delivery or within their first days of life. Medieval families had to be emotionally prepared for these losses, and communities had developed rituals and customs for managing the grief and spiritual concerns associated with infant death. Emergency baptism was crucial for babies who appeared unlikely to survive, as medieval people believed that unbaptized infants could not enter heaven. The causes of stillbirth and neonatal death were poorly understood in medieval times, though midwives and other caregivers recognized some of the signs that indicated babies were in distress. These might include changes in fetal movement during pregnancy, abnormal presentations during delivery, or signs of weakness or illness in newborns. However, without modern diagnostic tools and medical interventions, there was little that could be done to prevent many infant deaths. Maternal mortality was a constant threat throughout the medieval period, with many women dying from complications during pregnancy, labor, or the postpartum period. The exact mortality rates are difficult to determine from historical records, but it is clear that childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women of reproductive age. Medieval families had to be prepared for the possibility that wives and mothers might not survive childbirth, and communities had developed support systems for children left motherless by birth complications. The emotional and social impact of maternal death extended far beyond individual families to affect entire communities. Children left motherless faced uncertain futures, as stepmothers were not always willing or able to provide adequate care for children who were not their own. Widowed husbands often remarried quickly, both for practical reasons related to household management and childcare, and because of social expectations about male domestic capabilities. Medieval people developed various approaches to preventing complications during childbirth, though these were based more on traditional beliefs than on scientific understanding of disease causation. Pregnant women might wear protective amulets, follow dietary restrictions, avoid certain activities believed to be dangerous, and maintain regular religious devotions designed to ensure divine protection during delivery. The seasonal timing of births influenced the types of complications that were most common during different times of the year. Winter births were often more dangerous due to cold temperatures, limited food supplies, and reduced availability of fresh herbs and medicines. Summer births might coincide with epidemic diseases that posed additional risks to both mothers and babies. Despite the many dangers and complications associated with medieval childbirth, it is important to recognize that many women did successfully navigate pregnancy and delivery to raise healthy families. The accumulated wisdom of generations of midwives and caregivers, combined with strong community support systems and religious faith, enabled many medieval families to welcome new children safely. However, the ever-present risks and high mortality rates meant that successful births were always occasions for special gratitude and celebration. Comparing medieval childbirth practices to those of ancient civilizations reveals both continuities and changes in how human societies have approached the fundamental challenge of bringing new life into the world safely. While medieval Europeans inherited much of their medical knowledge from classical Greek and Roman sources, they also developed distinctive practices influenced by Christian theology, Germanic tribal customs, and the particular social and economic conditions of their time. Ancient Egyptian civilization had developed sophisticated approaches to pregnancy and childbirth that were documented in medical papyri dating back thousands of years before the medieval period. Egyptian medical texts included detailed descriptions of pregnancy symptoms, methods for determining fetal sex, and treatments for various complications. Some Egyptian practices, such as the use of birthing stools and certain herbal remedies, continued to be used throughout the medieval period, suggesting that effective techniques were preserved and transmitted across cultures and centuries. The ancient Egyptians had developed pregnancy tests that were remarkably sophisticated for their time, including methods that involved observing the effects of pregnant women's urine on plants and grains. While these tests were not scientifically accurate by modern standards, They demonstrated a level of systematic observation and experimentation that was often lacking in medieval European medicine, which relied more heavily on theoretical frameworks derived from classical authorities. Greek medical traditions, particularly those associated with Hippocrates and later physicians, provided much of the theoretical foundation for medieval European obstetrics. The Hippocratic texts included extensive discussions of female anatomy, pregnancy, and childbirth that were studied and copied throughout the medieval period. However, the practical applications of this knowledge were often filtered through intervening interpretations and local customs that sometimes distorted the original Greek approaches. Ancient Greek society had different attitudes toward pain in childbirth than did medieval Christians. While Greeks certainly recognized that labor was painful and dangerous, they did not interpret this pain as divine punishment for moral failings. This difference in religious framework meant that Greek practitioners were generally more willing to experiment with pain relief methods and were less conflicted about attempting to reduce maternal suffering during labor. Roman medical practices built upon Greek foundations while adding distinctly Roman innovations and approaches. Roman physicians developed sophisticated surgical techniques and had access to a wide variety of medical instruments that were often superior to those available during the medieval period. However, much of this Roman medical knowledge was lost during the political and social disruptions that marked the transition from the ancient to the medieval world. The Roman legal system also provided different frameworks for understanding women's rights and status during pregnancy and childbirth. Roman law included provisions for protecting pregnant women and ensuring that their children would be recognized as legitimate heirs, though these protections were often limited to women of higher social status. Medieval European legal systems inherited some Roman legal concepts, but also incorporated Germanic tribal customs and Christian religious teachings that created different approaches to women's legal status during pregnancy. Islamic medical traditions provided important bridges between ancient and medieval knowledge, preserving and expanding upon Greek and Roman medical texts while adding new observations and innovations. Islamic physicians like Avicenna and Rhazes wrote extensively about obstetrics and gynecology, and their works were eventually translated into Latin and incorporated into medieval European medical education. This Islamic influence brought new sophistication to medieval European understanding of pregnancy and childbirth. Ancient Jewish traditions also influenced medieval European approaches to childbirth through biblical texts and rabbinical interpretations that were incorporated into Christian theology. The Jewish emphasis on ritual purity and the specific regulations surrounding childbirth found in Leviticus provided the foundation for Christian practices like the churching ceremony and various purification rituals associated with medieval birth. Comparing ancient and medieval approaches to pain management during childbirth reveals significant differences in both available techniques and underlying attitudes. Ancient civilizations often had access to more powerful pain-relieving substances, including opium-based preparations that were used more liberally than in medieval Europe. Medieval Christian concerns about the spiritual significance of labor pains created additional barriers to the use of strong analgesics, even when they were available. The social organization of ancient civilizations sometimes provided different support systems for pregnant and laboring women. In some ancient societies, extended family networks and community structures offered more comprehensive support during pregnancy and childbirth, while in others, women faced greater isolation and fewer resources. Medieval European society's emphasis on community involvement in childbirth represented both a continuation of ancient traditions and an adaptation to the particular social structures of medieval communities. Ancient burial practices and archaeological evidence provide insights into maternal and infant mortality rates in pre-medieval societies. While exact comparisons are difficult due to differences in record-keeping and archaeological preservation, it appears that maternal and infant mortality rates remained consistently high throughout the ancient and medieval periods, though there may have been variations based on specific cultural practices, nutritional status, and disease environments. The architectural and material culture surrounding ancient childbirth sometimes differed significantly from medieval practices. Ancient civilizations sometimes built specialized birthing facilities or dedicated spaces within homes for childbirth, while medieval births typically took place in adapted domestic spaces. The availability of specialized birthing stools, medical instruments, and other equipment also varied considerably between ancient and medieval societies. Ancient religious and mythological traditions surrounding childbirth often included different pantheons of protective deities and different ritual practices than those found in medieval Christianity. Ancient goddesses associated with childbirth, such as Artemis in Greek tradition or Taweret in Egyptian religion, offered different models for divine protection during labor than did medieval Christian saints and religious practices. The preservation and transmission of medical knowledge differed significantly between ancient and medieval periods. Ancient medical knowledge was often recorded in dedicated medical texts and preserved in specialized libraries or medical schools. Medieval preservation of medical knowledge relied heavily on monastic scriptoriums and was often integrated with religious and philosophical texts, which sometimes led to different emphases and interpretations of ancient medical wisdom. Ancient trade networks sometimes provided access to medical substances and materials that were less readily available during certain periods of the medieval era. The disruption of trade routes and the decline of urban centers during the early medieval period may have reduced access to some herbal medicines and medical equipment that had been available to ancient practitioners. Educational systems for training medical practitioners differed considerably between ancient and medieval civilizations. Ancient medical schools, such as those in Alexandria or Athens, provided systematic training that was different from the apprenticeship-based training that characterized much medieval medical education. However, some medieval universities eventually developed medical curricula that were more sophisticated than those available in most ancient settings. The documentation and record-keeping practices of different civilizations affected how much we know about their childbirth practices. Some ancient civilizations maintained detailed medical records that provide clear pictures of their approaches to pregnancy and childbirth, while others left fewer written sources. Medieval record-keeping was often focused on different priorities, such as religious observances or property transfers, which means that information about childbirth practices must often be inferred from incidental references in other types of documents. Despite the many differences between ancient and medieval approaches to childbirth, there were also significant continuities that reflect the universal human challenges of bringing children safely into the world. Basic techniques for managing labor, supporting laboring women, and caring for newborns showed remarkable consistency across different time periods and cultures, suggesting that effective practices were recognized and preserved even when theoretical understanding was limited or incorrect. Regional variations across medieval Europe created a rich tapestry of different approaches to pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care that reflected local customs, available resources, religious practices, and social structures. While certain fundamental aspects of medieval childbirth were relatively consistent throughout Christian Europe, significant differences existed between various regions, kingdoms, and cultural groups that influenced how women experienced pregnancy and how communities supported them through the challenges of bringing children into the world. The Mediterranean regions of medieval Europe, including southern France, Italy, and Spain, were influenced by their proximity to Islamic territories and their connections to Byzantine and North African cultures. These regions often had access to medical knowledge and herbal remedies that were less available in Northern Europe, including sophisticated texts translated from Arabic and Greek sources. The warmer climate also meant that certain medicinal plants grew locally that had to be imported at great expense in northern regions. Italian city-states developed particularly advanced medical institutions during the later medieval period, including some of the earliest medical schools and hospitals in Europe. These institutions sometimes provided specialized care for pregnant women and new mothers that was not available in more rural or economically disadvantaged areas. The wealth generated by Mediterranean trade also meant that upper-class families in these regions could afford more luxurious accommodations and more skilled medical care during childbirth. The Iberian Peninsula was profoundly influenced by the centuries-long presence of Islamic civilization, which left lasting impacts on medical knowledge, architectural styles, and social customs related to childbirth. Spanish and Portuguese practices sometimes incorporated elements derived from Islamic medical traditions, including specific herbal remedies and techniques that were not commonly used elsewhere in Christian Europe. Northern European regions, including England, Scotland, Germany, and Scandinavia, developed their own distinctive approaches to childbirth that reflected Germanic tribal traditions, harsh climate conditions, and different social structures. The longer, colder winters in these regions affected the seasonal patterns of birth and the availability of fresh foods and medicines throughout the year. Northern European women often had to rely more heavily on preserved foods and dried herbs during their pregnancies, which may have affected nutritional status and health outcomes. Scandinavian countries developed unique customs related to childbirth that reflected their maritime culture and social organization. The prevalence of extended family structures and the importance of female networks in Scandinavian society sometimes provided more comprehensive support systems for pregnant women than were available in other parts of Europe. The tradition of extended breastfeeding in some Scandinavian cultures also affected birth spacing and family size patterns. French regional variations were particularly pronounced due to the political fragmentation of medieval France and the different cultural influences that affected various parts of the country. Southern France was influenced by Mediterranean and Islamic traditions, while northern France was more closely connected to Germanic and Flemish customs. The Loire Valley and other central regions often served as cultural crossroads where different traditions merged and evolved. The Germanic regions of Central Europe maintained strong traditions of female healing and midwifery that may have predated Christian influence. These regions sometimes preserved herbal knowledge and birthing customs that were less influenced by classical medical texts and more rooted in local traditional practices. The guild systems that developed in German cities also sometimes included provisions for supporting pregnant women and regulating midwifery practice. Eastern European regions, including Poland, Hungary, and the various Slavic territories, developed approaches to childbirth that reflected their particular historical experiences and cultural traditions. These areas were often at the crossroads between Western Christianity, Eastern Orthodoxy, and various other cultural influences that created unique syntheses of medical knowledge and social customs. The Byzantine Empire maintained much closer connections to classical Greek medical traditions than did Western Europe, and this influence affected childbirth practices in areas that were connected to Byzantine trade and cultural networks. Byzantine medical texts sometimes preserved more complete versions of ancient medical knowledge than were available in Western Europe, and this knowledge occasionally filtered into other regions through trade and diplomatic contacts. Island communities, including those in the British Isles and Mediterranean islands, faced unique challenges related to their isolation from mainland medical resources and their dependence on local knowledge and materials. These communities often developed particularly strong traditional healing practices and tended to be more conservative in maintaining ancient customs related to childbirth. However, their isolation also meant that they sometimes lacked access to new medical developments or imported medicines that were available in more connected regions. Urban versus rural distinctions were perhaps even more important than regional differences in determining the childbirth experiences of medieval women. Urban areas generally provided access to more skilled midwives, better medical resources, and more diverse communities of supportive women. However, urban areas also posed unique risks, including higher population density that facilitated the spread of epidemic diseases and pollution from concentrated human and animal waste that could affect maternal and infant health. Rural areas offered different advantages and disadvantages for pregnant women. While rural communities might have less access to sophisticated medical care, they often maintained stronger traditional support networks and had better access to fresh foods and medicinal herbs. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life also meant that rural communities were often better organized to provide mutual assistance during times when individual families needed extra support. Mountainous regions throughout Europe faced particular challenges related to terrain, climate, and isolation that affected childbirth practices. These areas often developed especially strong traditions of self-reliance and community cooperation, as access to outside help was limited by geographic barriers. Mountain communities also had to deal with altitude effects that could complicate pregnancy and childbirth, though they often developed local knowledge about managing these challenges. Coastal regions had their own distinctive characteristics, including access to marine resources that could affect nutrition during pregnancy and the influence of maritime trade that brought new ideas and materials from distant places. Fishing communities often had to cope with the temporary absence of male family members during fishing seasons, which affected the social organization of childbirth support and postpartum care. Border regions between different kingdoms or cultural groups often developed hybrid practices that combined elements from multiple traditions. These areas sometimes served as conduits for the transmission of medical knowledge and cultural practices, but they also faced unique challenges related to political instability and cultural conflict that could affect the stability of support networks for pregnant women. The influence of major pilgrimage routes on regional childbirth practices was another important factor that affected how different areas developed their medical and social customs. Regions along major pilgrimage routes often had access to ideas, materials, and practices from distant places as pilgrims and merchants carried information about different approaches to pregnancy and childbirth across long distances. Monastic centers played important roles in preserving and transmitting medical knowledge across regional boundaries, but they also adapted their practices to local conditions and customs. Different monastic orders sometimes developed distinctive approaches to caring for pregnant women and supporting families during childbirth, and these institutional differences contributed to regional variations in available care and support. Legal systems varied significantly across medieval Europe, and these differences affected women's rights and protections during pregnancy and childbirth. Some regions had legal codes that provided specific protections for pregnant women, while others left women more vulnerable to abandonment or abuse during their most vulnerable periods. These legal differences often reflected broader cultural attitudes toward women and family relationships that influenced the social context of childbirth. Economic systems and resource availability also created important regional differences in childbirth experiences. Areas with abundant natural resources or prosperous trade could afford better nutrition for pregnant women and more extensive support systems for families with new babies. Regions that faced economic hardship or resource scarcity often had to make difficult choices about resource allocation that affected maternal and infant health outcomes. The legacy and evolution of medieval childbirth practices toward modern approaches represents a fascinating journey of continuity and change that spans centuries of medical development, social transformation, and scientific discovery. While many medieval practices were abandoned as medical knowledge advanced, others provided important foundations for modern obstetric care, and some traditional approaches have been rediscovered and validated by contemporary research. The gradual emergence of male physicians into the domain of childbirth marked one of the most significant changes in the transition from medieval to early modern obstetric practice. During the medieval period, childbirth was almost exclusively managed by female midwives and female attendants, with male physicians called only for the most desperate complications. This began to change during the Renaissance and early modern period, as university-trained male physicians increasingly claimed authority over medical practice, including obstetrics. The development of obstetric instruments during the 16th and 17th centuries represented a major departure from medieval practices that had relied primarily on manual techniques and positioning changes. The invention of forceps, in particular, provided a new option for managing difficult deliveries that had previously been hopeless situations. However, the introduction of surgical instruments also brought new risks, and early obstetric interventions sometimes caused more harm than benefit due to lack of antiseptic techniques and limited understanding of anatomy. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries gradually undermined many of the theoretical foundations of medieval medicine, including the humoral theory that had provided the framework for understanding pregnancy and childbirth. New anatomical knowledge based on systematic dissection replaced medieval understanding of female anatomy, while improved understanding of circulation, respiration, and other physiological processes provided better frameworks for understanding the challenges of pregnancy and birth. However, many practical aspects of medieval childbirth care proved to be remarkably sound and continued to be used well into the modern period. The emphasis on community support during labor, the use of upright birthing positions, and the importance of experienced female attendants were all medieval practices that have been validated by modern research. Contemporary natural birth movements have rediscovered many traditional techniques that were standard practice during the medieval period. The development of hospital-based obstetric care during the 18th and 19th centuries represented a major shift away from the home-based care that characterized medieval childbirth. While hospital care eventually provided access to more sophisticated medical interventions and emergency treatments, early hospital obstetric wards were often more dangerous than home births due to epidemic infections and poor sanitary conditions. The discovery of anesthesia in the 19th century addressed one of the most challenging aspects of medieval childbirth by providing safe and effective pain relief during labor. This development fundamentally changed the experience of childbirth for many women and eliminated the theological concerns about labor pain that had complicated medieval approaches to comfort care during birth. Antiseptic techniques and the germ theory of disease developed during the 19th century finally provided effective approaches to preventing the postpartum infections that had been major causes of maternal mortality during the medieval period. These developments made surgical interventions much safer and allowed for more aggressive treatment of complications that had previously been fatal. The development of modern diagnostic techniques, including ultrasound, fetal monitoring, and prenatal testing, provided capabilities that medieval practitioners could never have imagined. These technologies allowed for early detection of problems, monitoring of fetal development, and prediction of complications that enabled much more effective management of high-risk pregnancies. Contemporary approaches to pain management during labor often combine pharmaceutical interventions with traditional comfort measures that were used during the medieval period. Modern birthing centers sometimes incorporate medieval practices such as water births, massage, aromatherapy, and positioning techniques that had been used by traditional midwives for centuries. The revival of midwifery during the 20th century represented a partial return to the female-centered model of birth attendance that had characterized medieval childbirth. Modern certified nurse midwives combine traditional skills and approaches with contemporary medical knowledge and technology, creating a synthesis that bridges medieval and modern practices. International variations in modern obstetric care sometimes reflect the persistence of regional traditions that can be traced back to medieval practices. Different countries and cultures have maintained different balances between technological intervention and natural birth approaches, and some of these differences reflect historical traditions that originated during the medieval period. The development of prenatal care as a systematic medical specialty provided approaches to pregnancy management that were far more sophisticated than anything available during the medieval period. Regular monitoring of maternal and fetal health, nutritional counseling, and preventive interventions addressed many of the problems that had contributed to poor outcomes in medieval childbirth. Modern understanding of maternal and infant nutrition has validated some medieval practices while discrediting others. The medieval emphasis on special foods and dietary modifications during pregnancy proved to be based on sound nutritional principles in many cases, though specific medieval dietary recommendations were often incorrect or based on false theories about food properties. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.